Okay, we're back. Let's talk about the importance of thinking, writing, and saying. The purpose of this lecture is to help you think about why you're doing what you're doing in Project One and how you might use Project One to help you develop your ability to think and write and say in a meaningful way. We're going to start here just with a quote from John Adams, our second president of the United States, who said to Thomas Jefferson in 1817, "I cannot contemplate human affairs without laughing or crying. I choose to laugh. When people talk about of the freedom of writing, speaking, or thinking, I cannot choose but laugh. No such thing ever existed. No such thing now exists, but I hope it will exist. But it must be hundreds of years after you and I shall write and speak no more." Adams here is talking about the his role as a public figure, Thomas Jefferson's role as a public figure, about the need to be able to speak truly and honestly, and do it for more purposes than just for yourself, for self expression, but also to be able to speak to persuade others. This freedom of writing, speaking, or thinking is a freedom that I think is reserved for those people who think, write, and say with a purpose in mind. Um, when we are generally just in our everyday lives, we have so many reasons for what we say or don't say, what we write or don't write. But what I think this quote shows us is that when you are trying to do what you're when you're trying to speak or write for a purpose, um, you can start to develop meanings for others. That is a type of freedom. I'm, that's getting a little confusing. Let me say this a different way. Currently, in our public discourse, with with what you hear from politicians, what you hear on the media, what you hear about the stories that are told, we often have a hard time trusting what people think or write or say. And you can see that clearly in the recent murder of Charlie Kirk and the way that people are talking about that after it happened. There's a whole lot of distrust of each other on the basis of what we think or write or say. And this distrust is a reduction of the freedom of writing, the freedom of being with each other and creating meaning together. What John Adams was hoping is that perhaps someday in the future we'll live in a political public environment where thinking and writing and saying would be more free. Maybe we get there occasionally, but right now it feels a little bit difficult to be able to communicate with others about our most basic ideas without coming under suspicion. So this lecture is a way of taking Project One and saying, exploring what we're doing in that project. Before we get into that lecture, let me make a couple of announcements. I'm going to send you an email on this. It's on the webpage, but let me just say it here in the lecture too. Announcement one: I've been cleared to return to the classroom next week on September 22nd and 24th. So we will hold class in person next week, and then I'll be posting your work for next week on Friday tomorrow. Um, so we're going to talk more. I'll tell you more when we're in person about what's going on with me and why we've had this difficulty. But just know we're going to be in the class next week. Announcement two: your original due date for stage three was I think this week or last week. I don't remember. No, it was on Tuesday. I never officially changed the due date. So here's the official due date. The official due date is this coming Tuesday when we return to class. You need to bring 5 copies of stage 3 with you to class on that date. We're going to start thinking about workshop, and we're going to be workshopping next Thursday. So we need to have those copies in class on Tuesday, ready to go. This leads us to some calendar changes. Now, I never officially gave you a day by day calendar for the class because I don't usually like doing that. I like to be flexible, but I do have a sense of where we're going here in the next couple of weeks, and I want to make sure that I put that out there just so for your own planning. So Monday the 22nd, your all your work for week 5 is due on Moodle. That's the work we're doing this week online. On Tuesday, on September 23rd, we're in the classroom and your stage 3 is due. On Thursday, we're going to be in the classroom. We're going to do workshop. The following Tuesday, we will be back online. I'll explain that more when we get into class. We'll be back online for that day. And then the following, on October 2nd, we'll be back in the classroom, and your entire Project 1 revised will be due. Project 1 is a narrative based assignment, at least that's where your evidence comes from. And so it's worth thinking about, why do we tell narratives? Why do we tell stories? Well, just a basic truth. We tell stories for reasons. Now, often we don't think about those reasons. We just start telling a story, but we tell them to express ourselves. We tell them so that we can build solidarity or closeness with the person we're telling the story to. We tell stories because we want fame or we want people to recognize something about ourselves. We tell stories to entertain others or entertain ourselves. And we tell stories to persuade others and to take action in the world. You read James Baldwin's letter to my nephew, and you can see how James Baldwin in that letter is expressing himself, and he's trying to build some solidarity, but he's also really being persuasive in that letter and trying to build some action. So I wanted to give you this quote by James Baldwin. In the picture here, he's speaking at the Montgomery March during the Civil Rights era, the Montgomery March led by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1965. And then this quote comes from an interview he did in 1979. "You write in order to change the world, knowing perfectly well that you probably can't, but also knowing that literature is indispensable to the world." What Baldwin is talking about is a responsibility we have as people in the world to interact, to look to change the world with the creative and intellectual efforts we make through writing. In order to get to those those creative and intellectual efforts that actually can speak to the world, that can try to make change in the world, we have to go through some stages of critical thinking, of ways that we develop our thinking so that we can write, so that we can speak. So here's some ideas about that development. Our first avenue to critical thinking is really through our feelings and what we feel about whatever is happening to us, and our personal experience and our feelings about that personal experience. One of the problems with that, though, is that we are so isolated with our feelings and our personal experience. We can't really see how those feelings or personal experience expand outwards to others. So you might tell me a story to make me understand better where you're coming from, but as you think about that story within yourself, it's hard to see why it's relevant to other people, or where that story what you might be trying to accomplish with that story. Just think of the ways that you think about your experiences in your head and how they get all jumbled up, how your feelings get all jumbled up as you try to figure out why those experiences are important. We'll go to another level where we start to think about our personal experience as evidence for our feelings. This is why I feel this way. This is what happened. This is what's important about it. And that leads us to an analysis of our feelings and experience. It helps us be able to analyze and make more solid what that evidence is showing. So here you've got an image by Virgil Elliott, a painter, a current painter, of himself looking in a mirror as he paints himself on a canvas. And that's just a way of showing how we analyze our experience, our feelings, to make them meaningful. Because if we just say them, or we just write them without thinking about why they're meaningful, we're not going to get very far. We're just going to be essentially in our own head making swirls. But if we can analyze them and think about why they're meaningful, break them apart a little bit, and then use them as evidence, they become more meaningful. Another level is to move outside of ourselves and start to think about others' feelings, others' experiences, and why those are important, and maybe relating those back to our own feelings and our own experience. This allows us to start to develop arguments for others. When we start to get an understanding of how others experience similar things or different things from us, how their feelings are similar or different than us, we can start to develop arguments about why that happens, or how we can start to understand others better, how they can start to understand us better. And that development of arguments can also lead to a research of learning how people's experiences matter through more academic research, what other people have said about others' feelings and experiences. This is a complication of the critical thinking process, right? We have moved from ourselves in our rooms just trying to figure out our lives to a much more complex type of thinking as we start to think about ourselves in relations to others in a critical and organized format. And there you see a picture of a guy taking photos of a group doing an activity as a way of expressing this research and development of argument for others. The final stage here of critical thinking is to think about, okay, now we've done this research, we've developed these arguments. Now, how do we make that meaningful for others? How do we create it into a presentation or a communicative act with others? Again, if we just go back to the very simple level, I experience this, I feel this, and you share that, you're not necessarily thinking about overall the persuasive elements of what you're doing. So after you've developed arguments, you can then start to think about rhetorical development. Rhetoric is is thinking about the way we persuade. And that leads you to a much more scholarly or professional argument that can be presented to others. And then that scholarly or professional argument leads to public action, your own action and sharing it with the public, and then how you expect the public to respond when they hear your argument. And here below this, we've got a TED Talk being done by a doctor who's talking about pain medication. Incidentally, this TED Talk was done by a very old friend of mine that I knew in elementary school and junior high. So, I know somebody famous, not terribly famous. So let's think about what all that critical thinking stuff and how that applies to our project. In stage one, you were just thinking through personal experience. You were just telling the story. What was the story? What happened? And in particular, because we're doing this on the theme of community, you're using a personal story to try to understand community. Stage two, your personal experience becomes as evidence for ideas, where you start to organize that narrative that you had, and you start to think about it as evidence and why that might be useful. And then stage three is the development of that argument, using that evidence for others, the written essay, and how that essay is moving towards doing something a little bit deeper with personal experience than just telling the story, than just writing about your feelings. It is trying to persuade others. Stage four, which you're going to be seeing next week, is a reflection on public argument, and that is to think about what was effective about what you did, what was meaningful about what you did, or how could you have made it more effective or meaningful. There is a reason we're doing this assignment, right? It's not just because I want you to write something or because you got to spell everything correctly. It is because we're thinking through this assignment about what it means to think, write, and speak for others. What does it mean to take authority in a piece of writing and try to persuade others? Next week, we're going to be getting into workshop. And so, workshop is a further step of this. It's really more down in the reflection area. Workshop is a way to understand our own rhetorical choices and effects and the rhetorical choices and effects of others. It allows us to see writing in action and allows us to understand how we have an effect. Now, in order for that to happen, and we'll talk more about this on Tuesday, in order for that to happen, your writing has to have or your efforts, the way that you approach workshop has to have effort, right? You got to put yourself in there and you got to do the work. You also have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to say, I don't know everything, or I'm not sure where this is going, or I'm not I am not done with this argument, but I want others to be able to comment on it, and you're going to comment on others. You also have to be open to your own brain as it's working through workshop, and open to your own writing and how it might change. And then you have to be in community. Workshop works when you are working with others as an equal, and we're gonna find out more about that next week. I will say also for this week's reading, you have some information or some guidelines for workshop up there on our Moodle page, and a model for workshop commentary. We'll talk more about that on Tuesday, but I want you to make sure you read it. Again, last week when I thought I wasn't going to be here next week, we were going to do a workshop online. I'm thrilled that we're going to be able to do it in person. So I want you to prepare yourself for that. The sucky thing about me being out and the difficulty. I mean, there's been a few sucky things about it, but the difficulties I've had is that it's really affected our class and the way and our motion forward. Now I'm looking at some of the work that you guys have turned in for your stage 2 and 3, and you're doing great. I'm going to give you some feedback on that in the next couple of days, but you're doing great with it. But now that you're moving towards that stage 3, I want you to recognize all the resources that you've had and that you currently have to help you develop it. So we've read 4 different essays on writing. So you've got a writing assignment, developing ideas for personal narrative, writing narratives, and weaving personal stories into academic writing. 4 different pieces that are helping you think through all that stuff on how you're creating a text. You also had 3 examples from the TED Talk, Misamong, I'm not sure if I said that right, and then from the article on community colleges with Clark, and then from James Baldwin, his letter to his nephew. You see 3 different writers doing this work, and those are good models. I just posted on our week 5 a basic guide to essay structure and a thesis. It's not statement, it's supposed to be statement. A thesis statement development sheet that should help you think through how you're developing this essay as an essay. And then, of course, you have the week 5 discussion board, which nobody has posted on, where you can ask questions about what's going on and how this is working, and try to get some feedback from others and from me. You got a lot of resources here. This is why the essay is due on Tuesday, because you've had all these resources, and I assume you've been working on the essay. So if you haven't and you're feeling lost, go back to those resources and see what you can find that might help you develop your essay for stage 3. It's always good to end a lecture with Barack. So Barack Obama said in 2012, "In my life, writing has been an important exercise to clarify what I believe, what I see, and what I care about, what my deepest values are. The process of converting a jumble of thoughts into coherent sentences makes you ask tougher questions." I really love this quote because it talks about process, of course, but what it does is it says that when you start writing, when you start working through writing, you can take your thinking from this very personal, uncritical space and move it into a much more critically thought out with writing that answers tougher questions. And then, as we know with Obama, his thinking to his writing to his saying led to public action. It leads him to speak out, to affect other people with the ways that he thinks, speaks, and write for others. That's what I got today. I hope you found this helpful, or at least got to see some cool images of Brock speaking. So keep working. Use the discussion board if you have questions. Send me an email if you got questions, and I look forward to being back in the classroom with you on Tuesday. Have a good night. Have a good weekend.